Hello and welcome to tonight's Twilight talk at the Ballaarat Mechanics Institute. I'm Prue Bentley, one of the board members here at the Institute. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we sit, the Wadawurrung people of the Cousen Nation. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and welcome any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders joining us at the talk tonight. Tonight's Twilight talk is the second in our series and the last for the year that is wholly virtual. In another first for the Institute, tonight's talk is not live but pre-recorded. Next week, we return for a Christmas special focused on a local organisation that fills one of the greatest needs of our community at this time of year. You might be anxious about feeding a group of your extended relatives at Christmas time, but spare a thought for the volunteers and workers at Uniting's Breezeway program who bring Christmas lunch and a lot of joy to literally hundreds of people on Christmas Day every year. This week, we're meeting Dr. Nicola Cousen, a historian and a consultant to the UNESCO Memory of the World program. Her research involves the history of Ballaarat during its first 2 decades, particularly its medical history. And tonight she's going to talk about one of Ballaarat's earliest pioneers who has great links with the Ballaarat Mechanics Institute, Dr. James Stewart. Please welcome Dr. Nicola Cousen.
Hello, and thank you, Prue, for the great introduction. And thank you to the Mechanics Institute for inviting me to present this Twilight talk today. On the second floor landing of the Ballaarat Mechanics Institute, just outside the lift, hangs a lithographed portrait with the inscription, Dr. James Stewart, who made a handsome bequest to the Ballaarat Mechanics Institute 1909. But who was Dr. James Stewart, and was he more involved with the Institute than just leaving it the handsome bequest remembered in this portrait? Dr. James Stewart was a surgeon, physician and philanthropist who came to Ballarat at the beginning of the gold rush in the early 1850s. He contributed to the establishment of many of the city's institutions, donated generously to the community during his lifetime and through bequests in his will. Stewart was born in the townland of Altrest in County Tyrone, Ireland in 1829. He grew up on a farm that had been in his family for generations, with his parents Robert and Mary Ann Stewart and his 2 brothers and 4 sisters. Stewart witnessed the hardships of the Great Famine in Ireland during the 1840s. His home county was hit less hard than other areas of Ireland, but some members of the district were still severely affected. Leaders of his community, including his father, assisted those in need in any way they could, and this provided him with an early understanding of community care in abnormal circumstances. Stewart left the family farm in the late 1840s to commence his medical studies in Dublin. He received his education during the Dublin Medical School's heyday, at a time when medicine was becoming more scientific. In 1852, he received both his licence in midwifery from the Rotunda Hospital and his licence of the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland. At just 22 years of age, the young surgeon set sail for the colony of Victoria as a ship surgeon. Many of Ballaarat's early doctors were ship surgeons, and the experience they received on their journey to the colony heavily influenced both their medicine and civic activities in Ballarat. Doctors could be employed on the voyage to Australia as ship surgeons on private ships, as surgeon superintendents on government ships, or as assistant surgeons. The ship's doctor had many roles on board an emigrant ship. He dealt with illness and disease outbreaks, accidents in childbirth, and he could perform small operations and postmortems in the case of deaths at sea. He was in charge of discipline and sanitation on board and could also conduct religious services, including sea burials, where the status and class influenced the scale and attention afforded the burial. The doctor's other duties included controlling space on board, passenger welfare, being an immigration official and a moral policeman. Diligent ship surgeons had a remarkable observational opportunity in the study of medicine because they could see illnesses unfolding in the controlled atmosphere of isolation and quarantine on board the ship. They could provide a more accurate diagnosis based on knowledge of symptoms and illness progression than doctors on land, who are only called upon as the patient's health deteriorated. This would have impacted the way in which sedulous surgeons such as Dr. Stewart practiced medicine and considered illnesses after they arrived in Victoria. Dr. Stewart shared this experience of shipboard medical learning with many of the doctors who would have become his colleagues in the early years of Ballarat, some of whom are listed on this slide along with the ships that they worked on. The ship surgeons were in control of a population responsible for its health and well-being. It gave them the experience and understanding of the value of leadership, crowd control, respect, human needs and improvisation in restricted conditions. On land, mistakes in any of these areas could be left behind in a move to another place, but on board ship the consequences were inescapable for months. And if the ship surgeon failed in his duties, his tarnished reputation would follow him to the colony and affect his income. In 1852, surgeon superintendents received a bounty of 10 shillings and sixpence for each immigrant arriving in Victoria to the satisfaction of the government, as an enticement to encourage attention to the health, comfort and improvement of the immigrants during the passage. This formative experience was a key factor in the medicine that these Ballarat doctors practiced in the colony. Their leadership skills were enhanced by their experiences as ship surgeon, where they were responsible for the health and well-being of the community for months at sea. These understandings and skills were to be very useful in the burgeoning community of the Ballarat goldfields and its need for the establishment of institutions. Dr. Stewart reached Ballarat by 1853. Just 2 years later, in 1855, he was joined there by his older sister Catherine and his younger brother Robert, who emigrated from Ireland. Robert Stewart was my great-great-grandfather and he took up farming at Mount Rowan. Catherine Stewart married John Cameron Proctor, who was a chemist in Ballarat. As a reminder of their home in Ireland, both Robert's Mount Rowan farm and Catherine's house in Windermere Street, Ballarat, were named Altrist. In June 1860, Dr. Stewart married Annie Frances Taylor. She had emigrated to Victoria from Dublin and was the sister of the district surveyor for Ballarat, John Hamlet Taylor, and prominent Melbourne lawyer Thomas Hamlet Taylor. James and Annie were to have no children of their own, but between the two of them they had 47 nieces and nephews in Victoria and more back in Ireland. Some of these children died in infancy, but it was still a very large extended family for the couple to dote on. Dr. Stewart's contribution to his Ballarat community was considerable. He contributed first and foremost to the public health and care of his goldfields community through his extensive medical care and benevolence during his 17 years there. He helped families at all stages of life, from babies through to the elderly. He provided for the public health of his community extensively through private practice, gratuitously as he helped to establish a public hospital, as an accoucheur, as an honorary surgeon and physician at the Ballarat Hospital and charitable institutions, as a founding member of the Ballarat Medico-Chirurgical Society, as a local Board of Health member, and as the public vaccinator for Ballarat. Dr. Stewart led at the inception of very diverse institutions that have helped to shape Ballarat as a founding member, board member, trustee, patron and benefactor. These included the Ballarat Hospital, Benevolent and Orphan Asylums, the Municipal Council, the Mechanics Institute, the Agricultural, Horticultural and Philharmonic Societies, schools, banks, the Ballarat Gas Company and insurance and mining companies. His care for many of these institutions continued throughout his life, long after leaving Ballarat, as he contributed through his munificent annual donations and subscriptions for over 50 years until his death. Soon after arriving in Ballarat, Dr. Stewart established a private hospital at Bakery Hill on the Gravel Pits goldfield in partnership with Scottish physician James Sutherland. Their 12-bed tent hospital was named the Ballarat Hospital and was situated at the corner of Humphrey Street and what is now Mare Street. The two doctors charged £5 a week for their medical attendance, medicines and food at the hospital. This provided them with an excellent income of up to £60 a week on top of their other fees. Similarly, Doctors George Glendinning and Alfred Yates Carr also charged £5 a week at their Red Hill private hospital in 1854. At this time, there was also a hospital at the government camp, which was for soldiers, police and camp staff. but there was a need to establish a public hospital for the destitute, sick and afflicted miners on Ballaarat. The bloody events of Eureka exacerbated this existing need. As mining processes evolved, so did the accidents they caused. For example, the introduction of gunpowder in 1855 was a new source of danger, leading to more dire injuries for the miners. A temporary hospital was set up at the camp until a public hospital could be built. This temporary hospital was supervised by Superintendent of Police Henry Foster and voluntarily staffed by Dr. Richard Wilcox Macaulay of the 40th Regiment of Foot. After Macaulay's regiment left Ballaarat, Dr. Stewart and Drs. Clendenning, Heiss and Tapley attended the hospital. These generous doctors met most of the cost associated with assisting 72 patients at this time. The Ballaarat medical practitioners were mostly generous men. Dr. Stewart and many of his colleagues assisted poor members of the community with gratuitous medical care and supported benevolent associations. In 1858, the Ballaarat Visiting and Benevolent Association acknowledged the promptitude and readiness shown by almost every medical man in rendering their services to the destitute. Dr. Stewart was a key contributor to the Ballaarat Hospital from its very beginning, and when it finally opened in 1856, he was elected one of the first honorary medical officers. He was the only doctor from the temporary hospital elected as an honorary surgeon in the new hospital. In 1855, Dr. Stewart moved his bustling practice to the Ballaarat township. Although initially practising on surgical qualifications, he practised as both surgeon and physician, as did many doctors in the colony until the 1860s, when a medical act restricted doctors to their qualified areas. He briefly returned to Ireland during the 1860s to build on his medical skills, and he qualified as a physician and a Fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland in 1864. By 1855, and after the events of Eureka, many members of the Ballaarat population felt that the formation of municipal institutions provided the best way to improve their community. Confidence in the warden and police inspector had been lost as they were government appointed. This push for local self-government in Ballaarat is another area in which Dr. Stewart was involved from the beginning. Ballaarat swiftly elected their first council within a month of being declared a municipality. Castlemaine and Sandhurst were two of the first 6 municipalities in Victoria, but had dwindling enthusiasm within weeks of being proclaimed. Unlike the enthusiastic people of Ballarat, Castlemaine took 9 months to elect their first council. Ballarat Municipal Council met for the first time in January 1856, and Dr. Stewart was popularly elected one of its first councillors. The Argus correspondent considered the new council to be as upright and honest as could be selected. The municipality encompassed the township of Ballarat on the Basalt Plateau. Eastern Ballarat had to wait another year and a half to have its own local government, and people considered it as a single Ballarat until the east became a municipality. In January 1858, Stewart became the Municipal Council's second chairman. Dr. Stewart was not the only medical practitioner in Ballarat who sought public positions. For example, Dr. Wills and Ellison were candidates in the March 1859 Eastern Council election, and Dr. Clendenning was a member of the Eastern Municipal Council and its mayor from 1864 to 1866. As mentioned previously, some of these doctors had made their way to Victoria as ship surgeons, which had given them a taste for strong community leadership and was to have an important influence on the development of Ballarat. Dr. Stewart and his fellow municipal councillors were establishing a more permanent and safe setting from the ephemeral and transitory goldfields life, with buildings, streets, basic services and institutions that would improve living conditions and serve the community for years to come. They were negotiating the steep learning curve with existing rules and institutions of empire, creating their own bylaws, learning the limitations of their power and adjusting decisions to suit the changing circumstances of gold mining life. They were also learning how to understand and make the best use of their physical environment. This called on the variety of skills and experience that each councillor brought to the council. As Ballarat and the council developed, its buildings had to be adapted to fit their evolving uses. They developed and changed over time, along with needs and resources available in their community. Council met the Baths Hotel until April 1856, when a temporary council chambers was built in Sturt Street. A variety of community groups used the chambers before they had buildings of their own. For example, by March 1857, an early group associated with the Mechanics Institute was using the council chambers every Friday. Through roles in the municipal councils and other civic positions, some of these doctors were also involved in early attempts to establish the Mechanics Institute. These include Drs. Stewart, Creelman, Allison and Kenworthy. Inevitably, their many roles would sometimes cross over, and this generally helped to expedite matters. Dr. Stewart's involvement with the Mechanics Institute included being a committee member, a benefit patron, a trustee, a life member, and a ready donor. Although interest in forming an institute offering better activities for many young men employed in Ballarat was strong in May 1856, nothing eventuated from early calls for an institution with similar purposes. The 1856 Institute Committee hoped that literature and science were starting to be appreciated because after the initial gold rush years, people's horizons were extending beyond just making money. They wanted to create a useful institution for mental improvement and enjoyment, and to leave their footsteps on the sand of time as an incentive for further progress. It was felt that a Mechanics Institute was required because it would be a means of doing much good for the young men who found themselves in the peculiar circumstances of, for the most part, living in hotels and only having what the Star newspaper described as the equally objectionable choices of nightly visits to unprofitable amusements or spending evenings in the public room of the hotel. Mechanics Institutes relied heavily on colonial and local government grants, but local fundraising also played an important part. Government grants were not uniformly given before 1860, and financial difficulty was a continuing feature of Victorian Mechanics Institutes. Fundraising attempts in Ballarat involved holding lectures and concerts and collecting subscriptions. Dr. Stewart was involved in many ways, including as a patron for some of the fundraising concerts. For example, in October 1856, he was appointed to a subcommittee that would organise lectures to raise funds for the Institute. These early lectures included the topics of labour and poverty, Toussaint Louverture, his life and times, mining ventilation, science of history, geology of gold, and lectures on physiology, mesmerism, architecture, and mining ventilation. By December 1856, the Institute Committee's reports revealed winter meetings had been badly attended, and he attributed this to the bad weather and to competing institutions. Yet they felt confident in electing a committee so that the Ballarat Mechanics Institute would become one of the first intellectual societies within the colony. Dr. Stewart was elected a committee member at this time, along with 28 others. The Municipal Council continued to play an important role in the establishment of the Institute, and Dr. Stewart was contributing as a member of both institutions. The Council was granted land as an Institute trustee in February 1857. There were a number of obstacles that they dealt with along the way, including having to argue that the site was actually in a central and populous area of the district, when the Surveyor General's office had claimed otherwise, when trying to reach agreement on an appropriate site. Then there was a problem with other people building on the land granted as the Mechanics Reserve. This held up the building of the Institute and required legal intervention. The council solicitor, Thomas Randall, advised that the only way to get the land free to build on was by bringing an action of ejectment in the Supreme Court. But in his experience, he had found that parties against whom verdicts were obtained managed to remove their buildings before a sheriff's officer could be put in possession. A portion of the land was occupied by mining claims and houses, including those of lawyers Cope and Odgier. Both were representatives of the Constitution claim, which had paid very well, and its supply of gold had nearly been worked out. Randall visited Odgier with a power of attorney for the Municipal Council, demanding possession in the name of the council and requesting that he vacate the premises. But he refused to give it up and pointed to his miner's right, claiming that it was his title to the land. The case went before Judge Barry in the Circuit Court in July 1857. As an indication of where Cope's interests lay, He belittled the value of the Mechanics Institutes, saying that they were neither more nor less than snug little reading rooms, got up by and for a few lounging people who were fond of reading newspapers without paying properly for them. Judge Barry found in favour of the Municipal Council, but the fight continued on. When grants were made for land for the Institute in late 1856, the land had not been considered to be auriferous. So when miners and mining companies commenced their mining operations, they were fully aware that the lands had been promised to the institution. The Crown grant converted the land into private property, and the mining companies could legally do nothing about it, even after months of possessing the land. Having to seek the ejectment of those who had built on the reserve held up the establishment of any building on the site and nearly meant the loss of the government grant. As a municipal councillor and trustee of the Institute, Dr. Stewart had to seek an extension of the grant because part of its conditions stated that the land had to be occupied within 6 months, and it had been impossible for the council to get possession of it. He successfully had the grant conditions extended in September 1857. The Ballaarat Savings Bank Company faced a similar problem with people occupying their land and turned to Dr. Stewart and the council for advice on how they successfully overcame the problem. The municipal councillors remained trustees, but this attempt to start the institute failed. Another attempt was made 2 years later, in March 1859. The following month, there was still no decision made about a permanent site for the institute to be built on. The site beside the Unicorn Hotel was favoured by many, but a new committee was formed to report further on the possible site, with 3 members from Ballarat East and 3 from Ballarat West to try to avoid sectional feelings. Dr. Stewart was one of the 3 members appointed from the West. 5 new trustees were elected in May 1859. They were Dr. Stewart, William Collard Smith, Reverend Cooper Searle, Frederick Young and Henry Richards Casale. The Municipal Council was to only hold the trust for the Institute until the new trustees were appointed, and in late 1859, the Board of Lands and Survey ordered for the Institute Reserve to be transferred to these new trustees. Although the Municipal Council was no longer involved with the Institute, Dr. Stewart's association with it continued. The inaugural meeting of the Institute was held in a room at the Fire Brigade in Barker Street in May 1859. By this time, the Institute had 600 members and an average of 50 to 60 people attending the reading room daily. The room was fitted with tables, seats and bookshelves holding newspapers, magazines, books and other reading material. The government placed £500 in the supplementary estimates for the erection of a permanent building that was contingent on the Institute raising an equal sum. The Institute applied to both Ballarat councils for funds in aid, and the West Council promptly voted £250 towards the fund. The foundation stone was laid with Masonic honours at the current Sturt Street site on the 28th of September 1860. Governor Henry Barclay visited Ballarat for the celebration, and flags of every nation formed bunting from the Unicorn Hotel to the gum tree on the Camp Hill. There was a procession which included the 2 municipal councils, mounted troopers, policemen, the Ballarat Band of Hope with 300 boys and girls, the Total Abstinence Society, the Caledonian Society, 2 fire brigades, the Foresters, Oddfellows and Freemasons, the Mechanics Institute Committee, the Mining Board and other local bodies. Dr. Stewart participated in the celebrations in multiple capacities as trustee of the Institute, municipal councillor and Freemason. Mechanics Institutes in Australia began as a hybrid of an imported cultural institution which offered intellectual recreation. In addition to the original purposes of educating tradesmen in scientific and mathematical principles, such education was designed to be part of self-betterment and improving society through becoming more valuable citizens. The object of the Ballarat Mechanics Institute was to offer intellectual and moral improvement to those who were willing to take advantage of it. The education it provided was very much influenced by its goldfield surroundings, and it had a significant influence on Ballarat's cultural development, as few other contemporary institutions were open to all classes. It began with egalitarian values, but as with mechanics institutes in the United Kingdom, became more conservative and middle class by the 1880s. Similarly to Bath's hotel and then the municipal council chambers in earlier years, the Institute was used for various occasions by the people of Ballarat and visitors to the city. For example, when the Ballarat to Geelong Railway opened in 1862, a large banquet was held at the Institute for the Governor, Sir Henry Berkeley, and over 400 guests. Dr. Stewart toasted the health of the Executive Council at the banquet and was a member of the organising committee for a ball held there after the banquet. He was to enjoy visits to the Institute on many occasions and in a variety of capacities. These activities provide an example of the wide-ranging uses of the Institute that he had influenced and its importance to the city in its early years. This included displaying his prize-winning fruit, vegetables and flowers at horticultural shows held in the Institute, attending meetings such as those of the Ballarat Bible Society, as an honorary surgeon and physician at annual meetings of the Ballarat Hospital, as a vice president of the Early Closing Association, for municipal council election result announcements, and as a committee member for various banking and investment societies. Dr. Stewart was a ready donor to local institutions, and he believed in leading by example. He would donate as part of a group such as the council or a mining company, as well as substantially in a private capacity. The ways in which he enacted his benevolence and philanthropy were many: through monetary subscriptions and donations, donation of goods, as an instigator and contributor to many institutions from their inception, and by providing his time and services gratuitously. In March 1861, Dr. Stewart donated 10 guineas to the Institute to be shared equally between the building and library funds. When he left Ballarat for Europe in April 1869, he resigned from all his remaining public positions and left a donation of 10 guineas to the Institute and other Ballarat organisations with which he had been involved. But this was not the end of his involvement. He attempted to resign as a trustee, but the Institute Committee deferred his resignation until 5 years later, in 1874, when they eventually decided that resident trustees were desirable since he had not returned from Europe. When Dr. Stewart died in England on the 2nd of June 1906, he had left provisions in his will that quite generously provided for many Ballarat institutions, the medical school and residential colleges of the University of Melbourne and a university in Ireland. He set up his bequests to be invested so that they would continue to provide money over time. In Ballarat, the Mechanics Institute received a share alongside the District Hospital, Benevolent Asylum, Orphan Asylum, Female Refuge and the Bible Society. Dr. Stewart's Mechanics Institute bequest was designed to establish a permanent fund for replenishing, purchasing and adding new books. This assisted the Institute with the object of offering intellectual and moral improvement. His contributions were recognised in the Institute's 1909 Jubilee souvenir pamphlet, which described him as wise as he was generous. Dr. James Stewart contributed generously to his community at many levels in a variety of ways, in educational, civic, benevolent, religious and secular forms. His involvement with the Ballarat Mechanics Institute reveals the way in which he contributed over time and led by example. Today, some 160 years later, we continue to benefit from the contributions of Dr. Stewart and his colleagues who have helped to establish the Ballarat Mechanics Institute. Thank you.
Ska, ska, ska. Jamaica ska. Ska, ska, ska. To the sky. Now everybody can do the sky. It's a new dance you can't resist. Now everybody can do the sky. It's a new dance that goes like this. Now everybody can do the sky. It's a new dance you can't resist. Merci beaucoup.